So to prepare for my Cruella analysis, I decided to watch through the other live-action Disney remakes to get a better idea of how bad they actually are, and where Cruella ranks among them. Turns out Cruella isn't the worst. Now what? Well, I might as well rank them all so I can lie to myself and say it was somewhat worth trudging through all of them. So without further ado, here is every single live-action Disney remake I cared to watch through, ranked and reviewed.
Dishonor on you! Dishonor on your cow!
Mulan is easily the worst live-action Disney movie because of how boring it is. It takes one of the coolest Disney main characters and totally strips away any interesting or likable traits about her. Instead of a courageous and funny and overall nice person, now she's cold and bland and can do literally anything she wants, so her journey seems pointless. I never once gave a shit about anything. The cinematography is shockingly lifeless. The characters are all bowls of oatmeal. The music is not at all memorable except for the pieces they reused from the first movie. It's overall a painful experience that had maybe one cool shot. There was that scene when the main female villain lady sacrifices herself for Mulan, and it transitions from her being a bird into her human state. It was literally the only time throughout the whole movie where I said, wow, that was kinda neat. If you're somehow a fan of this movie and expect me to give it another chance or something, you're better off just unsubscribing from this channel right now, because there is no force on Earth or in the universe that will get me to watch it again. It sucks and I hate it with every atom in my body, and I never want to even think about it ever again.
Wow, dude, Pride rock!
I haven't rewatched the 2019 Lion King in its entirety since I saw it in theaters about 2.5 years ago. One of the reasons is it's a terrible adaptation of the much better animated film, and I don't hate myself enough to want to trudge through it again. The other reason is I'm very proud of my review for it on Letterboxd, and I don't want to make another one that will get more likes. No, but seriously, this is such an awful remake in literally every way that I'm still shocked they went ahead and made it. It's not even technically live action, it's still entirely animated in a computer. None of the characters are played by real lions. This is just Disney sticking the middle finger at the old movie while still relying on its impact to animation and film in general. Not a single thing about it works, and I have nothing new to add that hasn't already been said. You're better off watching the YMS review on it when it eventually comes out, because at least you'll learn something from that instead of just watching an inferior version with nothing new to say.
Teaching another girl to read isn't one enough.
I may be a bit biased with this ranking since the original Beauty and the Beast is my favorite Disney animated film, but even still, this remake does such a terrible job at trying to recapture the magic of the original. The first and only time I ever watched it was at a double feature playing at a drive-in movie theater. They played this and then Bohemian Rhapsody, and I'm not kidding when I say that Bohemian Rhapsody was more worth my time that night. It's still a cringy and manipulative biopic that strips any bit of uniqueness that Queen had as a cultural icon, but at least it had nice music. The same can't be said for this movie. Every single beat made in the original that's brought into live action is ruined because it doesn't have the same charm or care that the original had. And any change made from the original makes zero sense and actively hurts the story, making it unbearable to sit through. It's one of the worst live action remakes ever made, and even if I wasn't incredibly biased, I probably would still hate it. Any movie that has this much auto-tuned Emma Watson is a failure in my mind.
Damn! Oh, damn! Oh, damn!
Have you ever watched the first 10 minutes of a movie and already know you're in for a world of hurt? The quickest I've ever been able to tell if a movie is going to be a 1 out of 10 was Troll 2. The second fastest was probably Aladdin 2019. Every single musical number was way worse than the original. Every single character was boring and uninspired. Every single change made the movie a lot worse. Basically, this was such a tiring experience that made me appreciate the original movie even more than I already did. It only got slightly better when Will Smith showed up, but even then it just changed from boring bad to irritating bad. I know I shouldn't compare Will Smith's performance to Robin Williams, since that would be cruel. All I'm gonna say is that if it's really that painfully obvious which is the better performance, maybe it wasn't worth trying in the first place. I don't care if this movie has actual actors of color instead of white people, the original is far superior from a storytelling perspective and will have more of an impact on film and animation. This movie has already been forgotten, and I hope it remains that way forever.
Oh dear. What an awkward situation.
Maleficent was a movie I had seen previously a couple years back, and I remember not liking it, but not hating it either. I thought it was a bland yet harmless film that tried something different, and it never really worked. Well, upon watching it more recently, it's actually one of the dumbest ideas for a movie I've ever seen. It's a reimagining of a character that completely changes everything having to do with the character to begin with. Its way of trying to make it seem legit is by just telling you as an audience member that you're wrong for ever thinking the original Sleeping Beauty was the real story of what actually happened. Say what you will about the original Sleeping Beauty, I myself have numerous problems with it, but it's still a fun movie that has enough great animation and an interesting villain to make it stand out. This movie just throws anything interesting about it out the freaking window in favor of a completely different story and character arc. The Maleficent in this movie is not the Maleficent in the original Sleeping Beauty, and the movie still advertises itself as if it's an accurate origin. Sorry, but it's kinda hard to humanize a character whose name literally translates to evil. Like, at the very least, Cruella didn't just have the character named Cruella, they made it into an alias. She was still given a real name. That's literally the only compliment I have for Cruella, by the way. This character is still named Maleficent, but has the personality of someone who's nice and friendly and overall a good person at heart. Literally the opposite of what a character named Maleficent is supposed to be like. But besides the movie being broken at the core, the rest of it is less than desirable. The acting is boring, the CGI is horrendously ugly, the three fairies are more annoying than Jar Jar Binks and Ben from Treasure Planet combined. It's a goddamn mess of a movie that still ended up having a sequel for some reason, but I'll get to that mess in a bit. Overall, I really hate this and everything it represents as a Disney movie. If you haven't revisited recently and still think it's good, might I recommend watching it again to see the actual garbage it always was?
I'm gonna kill you. And your dogs.
Shockingly not the worst, but that still doesn't mean it's any good. It's still an embarrassingly edgy misstep in trying to humanize a despicable character, and it deserves to be forgotten. If you want more details on why it doesn't work, watch my analysis video. I have nothing more to say about it other than it sucks, so moving on. Maleficent Mistress of Evil is honestly one of the wackiest sequels I've ever seen, and that's the only reason I consider it slightly better than the first movie. Oh, don't think that means I like it, nor does that mean I recommend it at all. It's still bad. One of the dumbest, in fact. Which is saying a lot. But when I think back to what it is I had watched, I strangely start chuckling a little. I was so genuinely baffled by so many of the choices made throughout this movie that by the time I got to the climax, I started laughing uncontrollably. I don't know if something snapped in my brain or if the climax actually was as crazy as I was seeing it, but I just could not stop laughing for the remainder of the film. There were times I found it hard to breathe. I was so giddy with laughter. Just the idea of this movie actually having a scene where fairies and woodland creatures are being gassed to death like a fucking concentration camp was so baffling and so idiotic that I could not believe what I was watching. Seeing a battle happen with a surprisingly high body count was indescribable. I had to keep reminding myself I was watching a legit movie produced and okayed by the Walt Disney Corporation and not just a YouTube poop. It was still bad and even boring at points, but the fact that I couldn't stop laughing for the last half hour of the movie has to count for something. That never occurred during the first Maleficent, so I have to rate higher on that principle alone. It's still not good, but man, was it not at all what I was expecting.
Let's get ready for Dumbo!
Dumbo is a movie that tries to fix what was already not broken. I know that can describe any number of these movies, but Dumbo to me feels the most like it's compensating for something. The original Dumbo is very much a product of its time and is definitely very flawed. Not only is it painfully simple, but yeah, it has some very questionable characterizations. I don't know what the majority of people think about the Crows. I'll just say that for me personally, I'm not that bothered by them, but if you do want to make the argument that they're racist caricatures of black people, that's still not a good reason to remake the entire movie. I'll give Dumbo the minuscule amount of credit for at least trying to be a different interpretation of the story by making the human characters more of the focus. Unfortunately, the movie is still called Dumbo, so maybe don't make them the focus. But either way, this movie is just boring. It is astounding how ugly and unfunny the whole thing is. I sometimes forgot I was watching a movie directed by Tim Burton. The guy has made some of my favorite movies ever, and this was the goddamn final product. It truly blows the mind. I will admit that maybe my rating is a tad overreactive, seeing as I was super angry watching this movie the first time, but with that said, I have no intentions of ever rewatching it, so I think my rating stands anyway. I guess it's not the worst Disney remake, but it is one that pisses me off.
If the boot fits.
I've thought about lowering my score for this movie since I seriously can't think of anything it does that great, but then that means it would be on the same level as this Cinderella, so I guess maybe it's not all that bad. Still not good, though. Cinderella 2015 was one of the earlier remakes made at a time before we realized these movies were never going to truly go away, and that's probably why the ratings for it are so favorable. As for me, not a chance in the world. It's impressive how a movie can have such a large scale and leave you with such little of an impact. I don't remember anyone in this movie giving a good performance or doing anything interesting. In fact, there's very little I remember, actually. I think I remember more from the Nostalgia Critic video on it than I do the actual movie. At least with that, I was learning stuff. Literally the only compliment I have for this movie is that at least it's not the Amazon Cinderella. But with that said, I at least remember how bad that movie was. It was insulting and degrading, and every frame of it could be classified as annoying. Here, I'm remembering less and less the more I try to think about it. How is that possible? So yeah, there's very little I can say about it other than it sucks. I have no intentions of ever watching it again, so I'll just leave it here.
I am not attracted to you anymore! Not!
I don't know why they decided to make a sequel for the 2010 Alice in Wonderland, but I guess if they had to, why did they wait a whole 6 years later? In any case, they did, and when you know, the sequel to the already bad adaptation just further ruins the uniqueness and charm of the original source material. It's like how they made a Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake and then gave it an inexplicable prequel. If it's already broken, just keep breaking it. But okay, if they were going to make a sequel, how was it? Well, as I said in my Letterboxd review, it did things better and worse than the first movie. For one thing, I can at least see a lot better because there are actual colors, but then that comes with its own can of worms because then you realize how terrible the CGI is on a lot of these characters. And the makeup is horrendous, and the set design is ugly, and just about every visual factor just doesn't do it for me. At least with the first movie, I could tell it was Burton trying to do his own style. It still looked ugly and gross, but at least it was his own. This was like Diet Burton, like someone was taking a world that was originally dark and giving it light where it didn't belong. So pretty much what happened to Justice League. And we still have the same boring Alice and the same boring uber serious story. But how about the things that this movie does worse than the first one? Well, for one thing, it just goes through the exact same story beats as the first one. We have Alice dealing with sexism and being pushed down by the weight of societal expectations. But we already dealt with that in the first movie. The only thing it adds here is to the running time. We also have an overly complicated time travel story that doesn't follow its own rules. Now, I love time travel stories. Some of my favorite movies ever are time travel movies. Those at least follow their time travel rules they establish, and even when they don't, they still give us interesting stories and characters. This doesn't follow its own rules, and so it becomes confusing to follow, but you also don't care enough to follow because you don't care about any of the characters. I'll get to the first movie in a bit, but like I said, if I had a choice to rewatch either of these, I'd prefer to go with the original. But if I had to really choose, I'd rather rewatch the original animated movie from the 50s. Sorry, director of the Disney Muppet movies, but maybe you should have made a third Muppet movie and not this.
Say, it works well.
The fact that they cut the beaver scene, one of the funniest scenes in the original, and made it into a boring 30 seconds that isn't fun in the slightest is one of the many reasons I hate this movie. Say what you will about the animated Lady and the Tramp, but it is so much better than this one in every way. This is pretty much the standard for these live-action remakes. It's exactly the same story as the original, with tiny details changed a bit to make it different, but just longer and more bloated and more boring. Every scene you're just thinking to yourself, wow, this is just like the original movie, but now made ugly and boring. Now the dogs are real and can barely express emotion, so it makes it harder to feel anything for them. Actually, now that they're real dogs, we can just bank on easily sensitive people to like this movie by just showing off how cute the dogs are. That'll replace any effort for the scenes to be emotional for themselves. Oh, and remember how laid back and simple the original was by not having a main antagonist? Sure, you could try and argue that the Siamese cats and the rat are technically villains, but come on, they're not on the same level as Maleficent or Cruella de Vil. This movie wasn't about having a straightforward villain. And it didn't need to. It could just be this simple 80-minute long love story about the characters just living life and discovering new things about the world. But fuck that noise, we need to fill that monstrous 111-minute runtime somehow. So let's throw in some dog catcher villain for no reason. He adds nothing substantial to the film. He's just there because they thought having a villain would make the movie more real or something stupid like that. And I know it speaks for itself, but the spaghetti scene is just garbage. It goes through the exact same story beats as the original, but this time it's slower and more awkward. God bless F. Murray Abraham and the other guy. They're clearly trying, but they can't top the original animated characters. Tony and Joe were fast and funny when they needed to be, and slow and taking in the atmosphere when they needed to. And that's because they were animated. Same with the dogs. They could seem shy and excited and all within the same shot. These dogs are boring and distracted by everything around them because they're goddamn dogs. I guess this is better than something like The Lion King and Dumbo because at least it has elements that make it stand out. The acting is fine for most of the human actors. The voice acting was fine for the most part, though I can't say Justin Theroux was any good. And the cinematography, when it wasn't focused on the dogs, was fine. But I'm basically grasping at straws because I can't say those elements were any good either. The rest of the movie, I was genuinely so bored that I can't really remember a ton of it. Let's be honest, the only reason anyone would have wanted to remake this movie was because they tug at their collars at the Siamese cat scene. Well, if you genuinely can't get past that scene, then you're better off just not watching The Lady and the Tramp in general, because this movie doesn't even fix that scene all that well anyway. So this whole movie is entirely worthless.
It's Tim. Baton! The spirals everywhere!
I give credit that most people probably liked this when it first came out because we hadn't been introduced to the truly horrific live-action remakes yet. I also can see that at least this movie was trying something different with its source material, giving us a much more serious and darker version of Alice in Wonderland. But that's about it in terms of compliments because I still think this movie is a gigantic piece of shit. Any attempt at trying to take it seriously is instantly nixed when the main character is so bland and uninteresting to watch. This is the same problem I have with something like The Matrix. Yeah, it's trying interesting ideas, but those ideas aren't supported by a lead who has the acting capabilities to make me care as well. And at least with The Matrix, it has cool action scenes every once in a while. This is just the ugliest reminder that maybe Tim Burton has kinda lost his touch and isn't going to make anything great anymore. Everything from the acting to the visuals to the story, everything doesn't seem to work at all. And you'd think a filmmaker like Burton could make something like this work. Hell, the idea of Tim Burton making an Alice in Wonderland movie is just one of the greatest potential movie ideas ever. Could you imagine if he made something like the Disney Alice in Wonderland but with more of a twist of Labyrinth thrown in? That would be freaking unbelievable. But sadly, we got one of the most boring and ugliest movies ever made that for some reason still has fans. I don't know, maybe there are people out there who are nostalgic for it at this point, in which case, good for you. As for me, I'm gonna stick with the actual fun version that Disney made 60 years before.
Hello there.
General Kenobi.
Christopher Robin is a strange movie that I honestly am both shocked and not so shocked as to why people like it. I guess it makes sense that so many would love this movie, seeing as it's igniting people's nostalgia for Winnie the Pooh, but there's a lot of factors that stop me from falling for it. One, it's incredibly obvious that they're pulling this shit, and I hate when movies are so goddamn blatant. Two, these characters look fucking horrific in live action, so there's nothing for me to truly be nostalgic for. And three, even if I was blinded by nostalgia for these characters, there's a whole library of Winnie the Pooh content for me to watch to feel all fuzzy and nostalgic over having to watch this movie. I could rewatch the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh, or watch a couple episodes of the new adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Hell, I could rewatch the Emp Lemon YouTube poop on an episode of Winnie the Pooh and still feel all warm and nostalgic for the series, because those all have the benefit of being good. This is just your typical cliched don't let go of your childhood storyline with terrible acting, ugly cinematography, and emotionally manipulative cutesy scenes that are more preoccupied with making you cry instead of actually moving you emotionally. It is cookie cutter levels of obvious and you all fell for it. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to see this kind of story fail. I love the Winnie the Pooh franchise, and I think Ewan McGregor is a fantastic actor. But if I want to watch an interesting movie about revisiting these Winnie the Pooh characters in my later years, I feel like there are better ways to make this movie more bearable to sit through. As I said, it's boring and manipulative. The main antagonist antagonist is a stuffy, one-dimensional bad guy with no redeeming qualities. That's not something I want to see in my Winnie the Pooh movie. I'd rather the antagonistic force be a lot more abstract, like the scenes in the 100 Acre Woods where the characters are afraid of the made-up monsters and Christopher Robin is trying to convince them that there are no monsters. Anytime we were in the 100 Acre Wood was the best part of the movie. It was fun watching this grown-up Christopher Robin explore this place he hasn't been to in years. But even still, I don't remember enjoying myself that much throughout those scenes. I was still pretty bored and found everything looking ugly and depressing. So yeah, even when I'm trying to compliment this movie, I'm still finding things wrong with it. Clearly it's not the worst, but as I said, there are better movies to watch to ignite my member berries. Ones that are fun and bouncy and actually look nice visually and not Snyder levels of dreary. The highlight of this movie for me was when the dogs had a movie night and watched the original Lady and the Tramp. It was sweet and wholesome and literally the only time I had a smile on my face when watching this movie. I want to say this is one of the dumbest sequels I've ever seen, but while it is, I'm not all that angry with it. I guess I kinda expected so little with a movie so stupidly titled as 102 Dalmatians that my expectations were too low and I just wasn't disappointed at all. Like, don't get me wrong, this is still a bad movie with the same issues as the first 101 Dalmatians remake. It depends so heavily on Glenn Close giving such a batshit insane performance that you're left with very little else. Both of the leads are incredibly bland and forgettable. The dog acting was unimpressive. I completely forgot that Cruella had a butler assistant in the first movie, so that when he showed up in this movie I was like, who are you? Eric Idle was the voice of a parrot who thinks he's a dog, and for some reason he never said anything funny even though he was voiced by Eric Idle. Honestly, there's just so little I can say about this movie. It was weirdly the only live action remake that didn't piss me off in some way, or at least not in any great length. I'd sooner rewatch it over Cruella, but I have no intentions of ever watching it again, regardless, so make of that what you will. Pete's Dragon has the direction of an A24 film, but the script of a bad 90s environmental movie. It's also a remake of a live-action hybrid Disney movie from the 70s that not many people talk about. I watched both Pete's Dragons, and I can say with no hesitation that this is the only time a Disney remake is better than its predecessor. With that said, it's still boring as fuck. The acting was fine, the cinematography had some nice shots, and I commend the movie for taking itself a little bit more seriously than the original film, but that still doesn't excuse the lazy environmental message or the tonal whiplash of the opening. This movie opens in the sappiest way possible by having everything be all cheery and nice and painfully obvious that something horrific is going to happen. And lo and behold, something horrific happens. It's incredibly amateur, and I'm shocked that I'm supposed to take it seriously. And as I said, the rest of the movie is painfully surface level with its environmental message. I give it credit that it at least ends with no clear villain as opposed to the awful villains of the original, but that still doesn't make up for the rest of the movie's faults. If this wasn't a remake, I'd probably be a lot more angry with it, but considering the genuine trash fires that make up this list, I should just count my lucky stars that it could have been a lot worse. I could see why it has its fans, but I just can't get into it. George of the Jungle. I had no idea that Disney made a live-action Jungle Book movie in the 90s, and now that I've seen it, I wish I didn't know about it because it's really boring. It has very little to do with the original animated Jungle Book. I assume it has more to do with the original book, but I don't know, it reads more like a Tarzan ripoff. This technically came out first, so I guess you could say that movie ripped this off, but I feel like Tarzan achieved this story better. I like seeing him learn about the human world, and I liked his relationship with Jane more than these two. I also think the action was better, and it looked more beautiful visually. I mean, yeah, it's still lame as hell with the obvious bad guy being the obvious bad guy, but hell, I at least remember Clayton and his death scene. I don't remember a damn thing about this guy other than he was played by Cary Elwes. Speaking of actors, the rest of the cast is weirdly stacked as well. John Cleese, Sam Neill, Jason Scott Lee, Lena Headey, and yeah, as I said, Cary Elwes. All of them were clearly trying, but their characters were so lame and so boring that I really can't say they saved anything. For a movie titled The Jungle Book, it sure did spend most of its time in a castle and a village, literally anywhere that wasn't a jungle. I have a feeling they wanted to make this a standalone remake, kinda distance itself from the animated movie, and try and be a more faithful adaptation of the original book. But I have no idea if it stays true to the book because I've never read it. And also this movie weirdly makes a couple of references to the animated one. There's a really out of nowhere line where John Cleese name drops bare necessities. It's a blink and you'll miss it line, but it's weird that it was included. There's really not a whole lot else else I can add other than I just didn't like it. It was boring and awkward, and I have no intentions of ever watching it again. High praise for third place on this list.
I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.
Jungle Book 2016 is technically better than the 94 movie in my opinion, though I say that very lightly since I don't like this movie either. I guess maybe I prefer this movie more since I remember a couple of the shots and the Christopher Walken King Louis scene, as opposed to the other one where really the only thing I remember clear as day is the cast. But still, out of both of these movies, I'd rather watch the original animated movie. I don't care if it's not a good adaptation of the book. The animated Jungle Book is a nice laid-back coming-of-age film that's funny, heartwarming, a little sad, and shockingly mature in its themes about finding out who you are and where you belong. It's a fascinating movie that honestly gets better the older I get. Meanwhile, the 2016 live-action movie is boring and dreary and overall a complete waste of time. It acts like a more mature version of the animated movie, but it still feels more juvenile. The characters are either boring or written poorly, the pacing is so slow, the effects are admittedly impressive, but they don't look half as good as just animating the whole damn thing. The only time I felt any joy throughout was the King Louis scene. And even then, that's only because it was executed so poorly and I was fascinated that a major studio movie made it unironically. It was like watching a joke coming from a YouTube parody. But no, Disney actually had Christopher goddamn Walken singing I Wanna Be Like You. It's easily the highlight for me, but that doesn't save the rest of the movie. It's still an incredibly shallow and depressing retread of something that didn't need fixing. For all of you claiming it's better than the original, I seriously beg you to reconsider because while it isn't the worst, it's still severely lacking. Well, we've reached number 1 on this list, and it's a movie I'm still not that jazzed about. 101 Dalmatians is technically the best live-action Disney movie, I guess. The best thing I can say about it, besides Glenn Close's batshit performance, is that at least I was never offended by any of the changes. It was basically the exact same movie as the original, but with more 90s cliches that dated even more. Yeah, think about that. This movie has aged worse than the Disney movie from the 60s. Roger and Anita were bland pieces of cardboard. Jasper and Horace were fine. The dogs were cute, I guess. Again, none of these aspects are better than the original, they're just live-action versions, so it's slower and more awkward. The only other thing this movie does well is Cruella de Vil. Glenn Close is clearly having fun with the role, and she's just going all out. I can't say it's a good performance, but it doesn't matter because at least it's entertaining. I at least remember it and I'm having fun a little, kinda. But then that begs the question. How does it compare to the original? Well, it doesn't. Try as she may, Glenn Close can't top the animated Cruella de Vil. I remember her performance, but I remember the character of the original more. I remember her dialogue and her movements and how she deteriorated over the course of the movie and became more of a monster. This one just had wide eyes and fell in poop, I think. I remember generally that she was crazy, but I don't remember specifics. And really, that's what a Disney live-action remake excels at being. Being generally the same, but can't quite get the specifics right. And so as time goes on, you tend to forget it. And honestly, I think that's for the best. Alright, I did it. I ranked and reviewed every single live-action Disney remake. It wasn't easy. There were times I was struggling to keep my eyes open because I was so bored out of my mind. I've made it clear that I'm very skeptical about remakes. If a remake is going to reintroduce an older story into the realm of live action, there needs to be an understanding for what will work and what won't. Dune works because it's visually amazing and simply told. The Thing works because it's atmospheric and has incredible effects. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with either of these movies because there's so much more to them that makes them great remakes. The other thing to understand is sometimes you don't need to bring something animated into live action. Animation is just as legit a filmmaking medium as live action. The Lion King works because it's animated and you can give expressions to characters you can't in real life. Aladdin works because you can give the characters life and animate them as quickly or as slowly as you want them to be. In live action, these elements are taken away and you're left with something slower and more awkward. But I'm pretty much just preaching to the choir at this point and it doesn't matter. Disney will keep making live-action remakes of their beloved animated movies, and there's not a thing we can do about it. As I said in my Cruella video, be smart when watching these movies. Don't judge them for how nostalgic they make you feel. Judge them as any other movie. Are they actually good, or are they stealing the success of something much better?
Hey, fuck you, man.